Our lectionary gospel lesson today is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, starting at verse 16. When Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown." But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed, except Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. The word of the Lord. There's one undeniable historical fact about Jesus of Nazareth. Even people that distrust the reliability of the Gospels accept it. It's that Jesus was crucified in Judea during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. If we put aside for a moment the Gospel accounts, which are clearly biased, it's hard to know exactly what he did to provoke the authorities so much that they had to get rid of him. Whatever it was, it must have posed a threat to them, and it must have been sufficiently public that the Roman governor allowed himself to get involved. The Gospels tell us essentially that Jesus got himself killed by condemning the religious establishment of his day for corruption, shallowness, hypocrisy. He incurred the wrath of the powerful by making a disturbing proposition, a life-altering encounter with God that would realign priorities, refocus energies, and reorder the world. So here's a question for you. Would the Jesus that you follow ever have gotten himself killed? Did he ever do or say anything that would provoke a violent reaction in his contemporaries? We're fond of Jesus' more memorable sayings. "Peace I leave with you. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Love one another. Here's a gentle soul that wouldn't hurt a flea." So how did he get himself killed? To pick up a few hints, let's hear Luke's story of the launch of Jesus' public ministry. The town was abuzz with the latest news. News travels fast in a place like Nazareth, especially when it's about one of your own young people making good. Word was that Joseph's kid had turned out to be an awesome preacher. They were even saying he had done some miracle healings over in Capernaum, just down the road. So you can imagine the excitement when the news spread that the young man would preach in the synagogue on Sabbath. Sabbath came, and everybody crowded into the synagogue, the men seated in the middle, and the women standing along the walls. After a song, the Shema confession, and a reading from Torah, the synagogue president invited the carpenter's son to read from the prophets. Taking the Isaiah scroll from the attendant, the young preacher unrolled it, found his text, and began to read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He finished reading, rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, who reverently returned it to its cabinet. As the preacher sat down to begin his sermon, all eyes were fixed on him. What would he have to say? A word of appreciation, perhaps, for the love and support of his family and neighbors in town. How would he explain that mysterious text? Then he spoke. This scripture is being fulfilled today, even as you hear it read. God had called him to bring good news to the poor. So would the heavily taxed Galileans finally rise out of crushing poverty? That would sure be good news. He would proclaim release to prisoners of war. He must mean those zealot patriots languishing in Romans' prisons. The blind would receive their sight. Would the young preacher heal someone here in Nazareth? Debtors would be released from prison. What could possibly force those detestable landlords to loosen their stranglehold on the peasants? Finally, the preacher announced he would proclaim the Jubilee year of land redistribution. The congregation broke into cheers of delight and approval. Never had they heard such eloquence, witnessed such power. Incredibly, this rock star was from their own town. This was Joseph's kid, right? As the congregation quieted down, Jesus said, "Now, I'm sure you're going to say, 'Doctor, heal yourself.' Right as rain, son. When are you going to do some of those healing miracles here in Nazareth?" "Well, maybe I should," he replied. "But remember the old saying, no prophet is accepted in his hometown." "Hey, what are you talking about? We're with you, buddy. Some of the stuff you did over there in Capernaum, just do it here. Then we'll know you're for real." Jesus said, "Remember the story about Elijah and the Phoenician widow?" "Sure, we remember her. God sent the prophet across the border to Sidon during the great famine. That poor woman, even though she and her son were starving to death, took him in and housed and fed him. They never ran out of flour and oil." "Yeah, so what?" "So," Jesus said, "why did God do that miracle for a pagan woman instead of for an Israelite man?" They didn't know, but they didn't much like the drift of this. Jesus kept going. "How about Naaman, the Syrian general? Remember him?" "Sure, our enemy got leprosy. His tough luck." "So he went to Israel to find a prophet of God to heal him. Elisha had him wash in the Jordan River, and God healed him." Never did get that story. Jesus said, "Here's the point, folks. In both cases, it wasn't an Israelite who found God, but a pagan foreigner. That's because all too often the people who ought to be the closest to God actually resist God's work. And those who seem the farthest away are really the ones who are the most open to do God's work. That's why I'm not going to do any miracle healings here in Nazareth. You imagine that you're close to God, but in fact, you're entirely too resistant to God's work. "Can you believe this?" they cried. "He just dissed us. No respect for his elders, no appreciation for his upbringing, no regard for his community. Downright cheeky, this kid." Cutting the service short, they chased him outside. Suddenly, their rage turned to mob violence. They dragged him to a cliff outside of town where they intended to throw him off. Somehow, he escaped that madness and made his way down to Capernaum on the shore of the Lake of Gennesaret. He found a place to live and continued his ministry of teaching and healing. In Luke's story, Jesus runs into trouble from the very outset. He not only disappoints his fellow townspeople by failing to do any miracles in Nazareth, but he disses them by telling them that pagans are closer to God than they are. As long as he's bringing fame to Nazareth by his amazing feats, it's fine. As long as he's preaching eloquent, inspiring sermons, it's hunky-dory. But as soon as he criticizes them, oh, how quickly their admiration turns to fury. So maybe we have two kinds of Jesus. A safe one and a troublesome one. Which one do you follow? The one who wouldn't hurt a flea, or the one who can provoke people to violent fury? Throughout Christian history, most of us seem to have preferred the safe Jesus, the one that helps us explain and justify the way things are. Thankfully, there have always been those who have chosen to follow the troublesome Jesus, to question the way things are, and to do something about it. Risking her own freedom, Harriet Tubman used the Underground Railroad to set captives free. Boldly proclaiming the gospel in wartime Germany, Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller organized resistance to the racist ideology of National Socialism. Arrested by the Gestapo and marked for death, he somehow survived Dachau. Striving to help free people from Jim Crow oppression, Baptist preacher and freedom writer John Lewis endured Klan violence in Montgomery, Alabama. While giving humanitarian aid to Salvadoran peasants during the Civil War, Catholic missionaries Maura Clark, Ida Ford, Dorothy Cazell, and Jean Donovan were seized by government troops, beaten, violated, and murdered. For daring to help people in need, they paid the ultimate price. All these people chose to follow the troublesome Jesus, to question the way things are, and to do something about it. Perhaps we should ask ourselves today if Jesus has anything to say to us about all that's going on around us. Childhood poverty, failing schools, homelessness, drone strikes, immigration policy, gun violence, elections, public health. Are we able to question how things are, or even try to do something about it? Or are we content to sit comfortably in church, studiously avoiding contemplation of all that is going on around us that is antithetical to the good news that Jesus proclaimed? What would happen if each of us chose a pressing issue of the day and we took a fresh look at it? It could be a personal or family challenge, or one of the issues that we've just mentioned. What would happen if we approached the issue by intentionally applying Christian teaching to it? Perhaps we could do some reading outside our usual sources, or we could talk to a friend about it, or start a conversation on Facebook, or have a chat with one of our church leaders. The question to ask is, can I hear Jesus speak to me about this. If we don't hear Jesus say anything to us in this process, or if what we think we hear is what we've always thought and no changes are required, we may need to ask ourselves whether the Jesus we follow is the safe one or the troublesome one. All of us hope that Jesus will comfort us when we need it. After all, he is the Good Shepherd. Lord knows we all need comfort. But are we also willing to let Jesus of Nazareth confront us when we need it? The Jesus of Luke's story changed the world forever by confronting people, along with their assumptions, values, commitments, practices. He wants to do the same thing today. If we let Jesus confront us, individually and collectively, we'll realign our priorities, we'll refocus our energies, and then, through us, God will reorder the world.